Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a definitive, chapter-by-chapter look at the hidden architecture of global stability. We'll be examining Henry Kissinger's truly seminal work, World Order, Reflections on the Character of Nations and the Course of History. You know, throughout human history, empires have risen and fallen, and civilizations have clashed over and over again. But how do they actually structure the peace? How do vastly different cultures agree on the rules of the game? This analysis is a serious, deep-dive reflection on the struggle to preserve stability in a world of competing civilizational claims.
Okay, let's dive into this with a pretty stark reality check. As Kissinger points out right from the start, no truly global world order has ever existed. What passes for order in our time is, well, it's actually just a patchwork. Historically, different regions, which were separated by vast geographies and limited technology, each defined themselves as the template for the legitimate organization of all humanity. They literally imagined that, in governing what lay before them, they were ordering the entire world. There was no single global system. So to understand where we are today, we first have to embark on a historical journey to see exactly how these localized systems were built and how they eventually collided.
Our roadmap for this exploration unfolds in 6 parts. First, power, legitimacy, and order. Second, the Westphalian System. Third, competing civilizational visions. Fourth, the American paradox. Fifth, disruptions to global order. And finally, the quest for world order.
Chapter 1. Power, Legitimacy, and Order. The core thesis. We must first uncover the fundamental tension between order and chaos.
So the crucial point is that before we look at specific historical examples, we absolutely must understand the delicate machinery that prevents complete chaos. Any stable system requires a highly interdependent balance between power and legitimacy. Kissinger's thesis argues that world order is essentially a region's concept of just arrangements, but to maintain those arrangements you always need 2 pillars. First, legitimacy, a set of commonly accepted rules that define the limits of permissible action. But here's the catch. Rules alone are never enough. You also need power, a balance that enforces restraint when those rules inevitably break down, preventing one single political unit from subjugating all the others. Without legitimacy, power becomes pure tyranny. But without power, legitimacy is just an empty promise.
Chapter 2. The Westphalian System, the European Blueprint. This takes us right to the birthplace of the modern international state system. We begin our chronological journey in Europe, and its journey to order was forged in the fires of unimaginable brutality. A century of sectarian conflict culminated in the 30 Years' War. This was a horrific conflagration from 1618 to 1648, where combatants resorted to total war, wiping out nearly a quarter of the entire population of Central Europe. Out of this pure exhaustion came the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Now, it wasn't a sudden moral awakening. It was a practical accommodation. It established a system of independent states, agreeing to refrain from interference in each other's domestic affairs. If we fast forward to the Congress of Vienna in 1814, we see this balance refined, and eventually, this leads to the modern European Union, which we see today as a highly unique attempt to pool the very sovereignty that Westphalia created in the first place.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive philosophical shift that made this European blueprint possible. Cardinal Richelieu, France's chief minister in the 17th century, was a man of the Catholic Church. Yet, he actively supported Protestant coalitions just to keep Central Europe divided. Why? Because he invented the concept of raison d'etat, the national interest. He argued that while man is immortal and his salvation is in the hereafter, the state has no eternal soul. Its salvation is now or never. Religion was decisively stripped from foreign policy in favor of cold, calculable national interests. This is what made the state the basic unit of international relations.
This cold calculation evolved into an absolute masterpiece of diplomatic architecture at the Congress of Vienna in 1814, right following the massive upheavals of the French Revolution and Napoleon. Europe's leaders masterfully constructed a system with 3 tiers to balance physical power with the legitimacy of shared conservative values. First, the Quadruple Alliance was designed to militarily deter any territorial challenges. Second, the Holy Alliance united conservative monarchs against domestic revolutionary threats. And third, the Concert of Powers institutionalized regular diplomatic conferences, acting much like a precursor to today's UN Security Council. It resulted in an extraordinary era of peace, precisely because the physical elements of power and the legitimacy of shared values were in perfect harmony.
Chapter 3. Competing civilizational visions, the countermodels.
Let's pivot from the European blueprint to see how other major civilizations historically conceptualized global stability. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the European blueprint of sovereign equality is not the only way to conceptualize global stability. We see a stark contrast in foundational worldviews when we look east. The Westphalian concept, born in Europe, assumes a multiplicity of co-equal sovereign states actively balanced against each other. But at the exact opposite end of the Eurasian landmass, China operated for millennia under a completely different paradigm. In the traditional Chinese concept, sovereignty in the European sense simply did not exist. The emperor was viewed as the absolute pinnacle of a universal political and cultural hierarchy, holding sway over all under heaven. It was a tribute system based purely on deference to Chinese cultural magnificence rather than an equilibrium of competing states. There's a striking character moment that captures this perfectly. During his first visit to Beijing in 1971 to reestablish contact after decades of hostility, Kissinger casually remarked that China was a land of mystery. Premier Zhou Enlai calmly replied with this profound statement: "You will find it not mysterious. When you have become familiar with it, it will not seem so mysterious as before." Zhou observed that there were 900 million Chinese, and to them, their system seemed perfectly normal. This highlights a critical challenge for us today. What feels foreign, hierarchical, or incompatible to the West has historically had immense internal cohesion and felt completely normal to China.
Similarly, we find another fundamentally different concept of order in the historical Islamic worldview. While Europe was busy building a multi-state order divided by borders, the traditional Islamic concept envisioned a unitary global system. The world was conceptually divided into the realm of peace, the lands of Islam, and the realm of war, populated by unbelievers. The ultimate theoretical goal was a world brought into harmony by a single faith. Just like the historical Chinese model, this universalist vision inherently challenges the Westphalian idea of permanent, static borders and sovereign equality regardless of internal beliefs.
Chapter 4. The American Paradox. The Ambivalent Superpower. Let's introduce the indispensable defender of the European order. We now turn to a nation that became the indispensable defender of the European order, yet one that remains deeply ambivalent about traditional European power politics, the United States. Its unique foreign policy mindset presents a fascinating paradox. In Europe, strategic equilibrium meant balancing power, regardless of what a country's domestic political system looked like. You just made alliances of convenience to maintain the balance. But America was founded as a city upon a hill. Its vision rests firmly on moral universalism. Historically, the U.S. has viewed its own domestic values as self-evidently universal and applicable to all mankind, believing that true peace can only be achieved not through cynical power balances, but through the spread of democratic principles. It is a foreign policy often driven by a project of spreading values, rather than just traditional national interest.
Yet, as President Theodore Roosevelt recognized, idealism alone cannot secure the peace. Delivering a Nobel Peace Prize lecture, Roosevelt offered this deeply Hobbesian analysis. In new and wild communities where there is violence, an honest man must protect himself. It is both foolish and wicked to persuade him to surrender his arms. He understood that in a world lacking a global sovereign, an honest nation absolutely must protect itself. Even the most idealistic, rules-based international orders ultimately require the backing of sheer, undeniable force. The United States has constantly struggled to navigate this very delicate relationship between its vast military power and its soaring moral principles.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Chapter 5, Disruptions to Global Order, the Modern Era. The traditional diplomatic frameworks we've just discussed are now facing unprecedented stress. Today, technology and ideology are actively shattering the old Westphalian equilibrium. Consider these three modern disruptions. First, nuclear proliferation. In the past, shifting the balance of power took decades of industrial growth or massive territorial conquest. Today, the acquisition of nuclear weapons can alter regional balances dramatically and instantly. Second, cyber warfare has shifted strategic rivalries into the invisible information realm, where agreed-upon rules of conduct barely exist. And third, the digital era itself. Instantaneous communication projects events globally in real time, demanding that leaders react with quick, instantaneous slogans rather than deep, historical reflection. The unprecedented speed and destructive capability of the modern age makes maintaining a thoughtful equilibrium incredibly difficult.
Chapter 6. The Quest for World Order. The Final Provocation. Can humanity forge a unified system? This brings us to the climax of our analysis. The primary takeaway from Kissinger's reflections is that today's leaders must rise above the daily urgency of endless crises.
We are facing a world of increasingly contradictory realities. To survive, he argues, we need to cultivate a modernized Westphalian system, one informed by contemporary realities, but rooted in a value-neutral framework. It must be a system that respects the multifariousness of the human condition, combining different cultural realities into a shared architecture of order. Because order without freedom eventually creates its own violent counterpoise, and freedom simply cannot be secured without a framework of order to keep the peace. They are inherently, inextricably interdependent.
And so, we are left to ponder the ultimate challenge to statesmanship in our time. As the balance of power shifts and new claims to legitimacy multiply across the globe, we face a profound unknown. Can regions with such divergent cultures, histories, and traditional theories of order actually vindicate the legitimacy of any common system? Thank you for joining me for this explainer.